Okay, so first thing is some backstory so that we can kind of have like an image of what was the time, like when was Marcion, before who was Marcion. Like everything else, it's hard to say. There are disagreements all over the place. There is, however, a kind of general consensus on some things. And so I've aggregated all of it. So some of it might seem contradictory, but it's because I want to give you both views and not just shove one opinion down your throat. So Marcion of Sinope, some pronounce it Sinope. The majority, from everything I know, is Sinope. But who knows, because I am the worst possible person to ever ask about how to properly pronounce something. Best we can tell, 85 to 160 AD was his zone of reality. He was born in Sinope, which was a port city south of the Black Sea, which would be Turkey, modern day. At the time, just for further context, this would be north of Galatia, if you know where that is. Perhaps that's not helpful, but if you do, it's just north of there. The Proto-Orthodox Christians, and in case you weren't here last week, the Proto-Orthodox is the way that scholars identify the first Christians. These were people that did not belong to denominations because they didn't really exist. You had some, but from their perspective, like that wasn't real. You were either a Christian or you were a heretic. There wasn't like the Protestants and the Catholics, and they're all Christian, but they believe different things. There was none of that. There was Christian or heretic, period. So the Proto-Orthodox were the ones that were believed to be Christian, and these were the true Christians by merit of early theologians, which is already problematic, but we'll come back to that. So these Proto-Orthodox demonized Marcion to the point of him being associated with the term heresy, which coincidentally was synonymous essentially with Gnosticism, which we talked about last week. And again, if you weren't with us for that, I would recommend watching that after this, because little lights will go off, because I don't want to repeat things too much. But Gnosticism was a version of Christianity. They believed they were the true Christians. The Proto-Orthodox, as we call them now, believed they were the true Christians. They both thought each other were heretical. And so the Proto-Orthodox, the legit ones, quote unquote, called Marcion a heretic. He was a heretic and associated him with Gnosticism. Now, when you get into Marcion, what he actually believed, there's no way to logically put him in the condition of a Gnostic, because he just didn't believe those things. There were some similarities, but to call him a Gnostic is just dishonest. And that is objective, I would say. I think it's objective among all scholars. I don't really hear any modern scholars anymore using the term Gnostic to describe Marcion. One of the most important early theologians was Irenaeus. Important in a negative way, because Irenaeus was popular, prominent, listened to, or read, because he was a writer. He was also, during this time, one of the loudest, most outspoken against Gnosticism. He was a huge part of what won the rhetoric war of Gnosticism becoming heresy, the two terms becoming synonymous with one another. So he would tell people not to read the Gnostic texts and to view Marcion as nothing but a heretical lunatic, lumping them together because that's what these early Christians did. If you didn't align with what they believed, you were just a heretic. And oftentimes were called a Gnostic, even if you did not believe Gnostic theology, or even if you wouldn't fit cleanly in that boat. Many scholars believe Marcion may have been a member of the Jewish community, not a pagan, as he was called, because what better way to demonize somebody during that time than call them a pagan? And that's what a lot of the detractors claimed, was that he was pagan. However, this is one of these times where it's very unclear. Some scholars say that he was from the Jewish community. Others say, no, he was a Gentile. So these are opposite things, and it changes some of the story context. I tend to lean towards that perhaps he was a part of the Jewish community, so I'm going to read the rest of his life story from that perspective, just to be, again, totally transparent. I believe it makes sense, so I run with that. But I am keenly aware that there's a possibility he was a Gentile. Marcion owned and ran a ship business, or a shipping business. The specifics of the business we don't really know, but contextually, scholars have been able to gather kind of a story that would make sense based on other things. So some of these scholars speculate that he owned a number of ships, and what he did was probably rented them out, specifically, potentially, the Roman government. So as Sinope was a core center of the Roman navy, it would make sense then that Marcion, owning a shipping company, would rent to the government. He would rent these ships to Rome to use for whatever purposes. We know that he moved at one point to Rome sometime around 130, which is important because of the Jewish war. So sometime around 130, in order to create a didascalia, which was like a, you can like picture it as a classroom teaching, which makes sense again contextually with some of the other things he was doing and his kind of kick towards Christianity. From this, many have concluded that he had already begun writing about the traditions and the teachings of Jesus, and that perhaps that's what he was trying to teach. That was his angle and the topic of why he was trying to do this, which at the time was still a largely Jewish tradition. So in this early part of Christianity, Christianity was still very Jewish, which takes you into a lot of the rabbit holes about the Gospels and why, as time went on in the Gospels, authorship-wise, like when they were published, so Mark being first, Matthew and Luke coming later, and John being last, why there seems to be a significant and consistent rise in Jewish elements in the Gospels as time goes on. Mark having very little, Matthew and Luke being identical in many ways, having more, and then John having quite a bit, and John also is just kind of wild in a bunch of other ways too. But remembering that the early Christians were very much enthralled with Jewish traditions still, which you can also take notes from Paul in his epistles where he's kind of on everybody's butt about, we don't do this anymore. This isn't what we do. Things are different now. He's obviously writing to churches that are still largely practicing Jewish tradition while being under a Christian label. So he seemed to have begun these writings back in Sinope, which had a very important Jewish Greek-speaking community. Contextually important and otherwise. Aquila, not the one you're thinking of, was one of the revisers of the Jewish Bible, and that individual lived there. So what many assume is that Marcion and that, let's call it a scholar, lived there. And so they were in close proximity to one another. So a scholarly assumption then is that Sinope had more than that they had a vibrant community, a vibrant population of very scripturally interested individuals, highly educated people, because that's really the only people who wrote at this time. Most people didn't write. A lot of people still didn't read. It was getting better for sure, but you were on the up and up if you were able to write. And if you were able to translate, you were obviously kind of at the top of the game. But specifically with these people who are scripturally interested, those who had a very deep understanding of the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. We can picture Marcion having been involved and interconnected to this culture, which makes a lot of sense as we see some of the things that happen moving forward. Now, story-wise, backing way up, what else is going on at the time in the place? In Rome during this period, people are going through the largest revolt against the Roman occupation that had ever happened. So Bar Kokhba, there was a revolt in 135 that he led. This was a literal war, and it lasted about 3 years. The way that it ended, the way it concluded, was in a way where both groups lost dramatically. You could kind of look at it. It's not a great representation, but kind of like what's going on in the East right now. Both sides are just being decimated. This is a similar thing. One side will still come out on top, but both sides are suffering such dramatic losses that it is a loss for both sides. Big picture. The downstream results of this was a drastic and dramatic mix in the sociological makings. Like you had this massive mix of peoples, of types of peoples, culture. In Israel, Bar Kokhba would later become a messiah figure literally. And the interesting and sad thing about it was that a lot of Christians got on board with it. So there were a lot of early Christians who backed him and this whole Messiah thing. We know from Justin Martyr, who is really prominent, and maybe we can talk about him at some point. But Justin Martyr left us an understanding that it seemed the Christians who did not side with Bar Kokhba were put under wild restrictions or were sentenced to death. So this would be kind of the opposite of what we talk about with a lot of early Christians, where a lot of these early Christians were totally willing to die for their faith and for what they believed and knew to be true. This is a good example of, well, it wasn't all of them. It wasn't all of them. There were some that were not willing to die for what was true and were not willing to die for what they believed in. So Marcion in Sinope, he's an entrepreneur who likely relies on the Roman government to conduct business in order to sustain himself. This is how he makes money. This is how he survives. So this war would be impactful to him, both personally and also culturally, because this was affecting his literal life and it was affecting his business. So it's a very personal deal for him. He's watching what's happening. He's watching Rome and the Jewish culture basically go to war and completely decimate each other. That's the perspective. He would be seeing that the Jewish revolt from his perspective, possibly being from the Jewish community, possibly not, but possibly from the Jewish community. He's seeing it from that perspective. He's watching the Jewish people engage in this war, likely causing wild damage to him personally, but definitely to society. So he's being impacted. That just needs to be in frame because it makes other things make sense. So he is suffering from this war personally, as is his culture sociologically. The results of the war, among other things, included two things, basically. The loss of several of Rome's armies, prominent, big deals. The only reason they won is because they had neighboring cultures come to their aid. So had they not had that, they would have been in trouble. Possibly would have changed the outcome. The other thing is that the Jews were then banished from Jerusalem. So they lost their holy place. They lost something wildly significant to their religious function. It was then made into a Roman devotion, a place of devotion, which is just kind of an insult to injury. And it's not the only time something like that happened. There are other examples that at some point we'll talk about. Snake to the dome should just be a given at this point. You misspelled let's like this thing now before Father Joe gets another snake to the dome. Got it. I am now up to speed. Yes, Marcion was a merchant. Not bad at all. No, we're the true Christians. Marcion was a economic gangster, basically. Not really, but he obviously did pretty well for himself. It seems relatively clear that he did well for himself. He was a relatively well-to-do kind of guy. Alrighty, so Marcion could be assumed to have seen all of what was going on. The defeat, in a sense, for both sides. Marcion could have watched it, lived it, and then made a connection to what the Jews had gone through here, to what they had gone through in the scriptures, in the Septuagint, in the Old Testament. Because again, perspective-wise, the New Testament does not exist at this point. It's not a thing. There is no collection or compilation of Christian texts. There are just texts kind of wandering and floating around. But up until this point, everything was passed orally. That's where we are. So he saw what happened in the Old Testament scriptures and now potentially has made some kind of like personal connection to what is going on now. He could have seen this as the embodiment of God or Yahweh and what had resulted here due to this religion and what had resulted in the Old Testament due to this religion. Lots of war, lots of death, lots of destruction. What happened here is reminiscent of the Exodus and a number of other things in the Old Testament. The death of thousands of soldiers in the name of God, along with everything else that happens during war in the name of God, if it is a religious war. Perhaps this is why Marcion then decides to dig into the Old Testament. Why he decides, like, this is going to be something I get involved in. I want to understand more. What happened here is Marcion went in search of the God or Messiah that was often spoken about, what was being passed around, what was being talked about orally, and and some documents floating around, but nothing official yet. None of that had been written yet. Marcion saw a new Torah. That's what he seems to be going after, is what should this actually be? We have the Septuagint, we have the Old Testament in Greek. This God, something seems off. And now seeing this Jewish war now, it seems consistent with the Old Testament, the behavior, the outcomes, the pain, everything. He was searching for something different. The new Torah is how it's described, based on the Sermon on the Mount. That was a big deal. The Sermon on the Mount, the story of it. A God who teaches when you are struck to do not strike back. If Rome hits the Jews should not hit back. He seemingly found this new Torah in what would be the character of Jesus Christ. So Marcion kind of diverts his attention to this character, these stories that are being told about Jesus Christ. Marcion did, however, see what many of us see without wanting to really admit it, or you don't see, and that's fine. But some of us do. I've voiced it many times, so I personally do. But Marcion seems to have seen that there was some kind of something in the way between Yahweh of the Old Testament and Jesus Christ of the New Testament. He seemed to think that there was something different about them. In fact, Marcion went much further and completely denied Yahweh. He denied the Old Testament entirely as having anything to do with the character of Jesus Christ. And therefore he abandons the Old Testament as a text altogether. He gets rid of it, which is important as Marcion begins to do what he's going to do. He sought to replace what was the vengeful in his perception, the vengeful deity of the Old Testament, with what seems to be, from his perspective, the rational and compassionate deity of the New Testament. To replace the deity who told its people to fight and take revenge on its enemies with the deity who taught how to live in communion with them. This is, by all accounts, it's the driver for Marcion. Like, this is what gets him in. It doesn't make sense to him. And so he's trying to seek sense. He's trying to seek how to make it make sense. I hope that clip was informational. If it wasn't, I hope it was at least kind of amusing or entertaining in some fashion. Either way, if you want to watch the full live stream, you can click right here. We do a number of these live streams every week on 2 different YouTube channels, at Tattooed Theist and at Live Bible Study. If you click the link to our Discord server in the description below, there's an events page there that shows you where and when all the live streams are. You'll also then be a part, whether you like it or not, of our dysfunctionally beautiful Discord family.